"Be quiet. Don't say a word." The voice was small, trembling, but sharp enough to slice through the silence of the underground parking lot. Richard Collins froze with the key still in his hand, the door of his sleek black sedan half open. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again, coming from inside the car. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior. In the back seat, a little girl, no more than 7 years old, was huddled low, her dark eyes wide with fear, and something else, something far too old for a child to carry. The overhead light flickered, painting the scene in brief flashes of white and shadow. Richard's pulse quickened. He had closed deals worth millions, faced boardrooms full of ruthless executives without breaking a sweat, but this was different. "Who are you?" he whispered, sliding into the driver's seat carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile moment. The girl lifted her chin just enough to speak. "They're watching," she murmured, nodding toward the tall glass tower of Collins Tech looming behind them. "Your partner and his assistant. They said you'd be here now." Richard's stomach tightened. The girl's voice carried urgency, yet there was something steady in her tone, as if she had rehearsed these words 100 times in her head before daring to speak them aloud. It made no sense. A stranger's child in his car, warning him about the very people he trusted most. But even through her tattered clothes and the dirt smudged across her cheek, Richard could see it, the spark of intelligence in her eyes. And in that instant, before he even knew her name, he realized this encounter would change everything. Richard Collins had spent 3 decades building Collins Tech from the ground up. What began as a rented desk in a shared office had grown into a technology empire valued at nearly $250 million. To the world, Richard was the man with the golden touch, an innovator, a leader, a name that carried weight in every boardroom he entered. But to him, it was simpler than that. He was just a man who believed in hard work, loyalty, and trust. For 15 years, his most trusted partner had been Harold Grant, a sharp, charismatic businessman with an easy smile and a talent for winning investors. And for over a decade, his executive assistant, Victoria Lane, had been the one person who knew his schedule better than he did, his confidant, his right hand, almost like family. So why was a child, this fragile little stranger, crouched in the back seat of his car, whispering warnings about betrayal? The girl's voice replayed in his mind. "They said you're going to sign something without really looking at it, that tomorrow you won't own anything anymore." Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter, though the engine was still off. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, streaks of gray at his temples, a face that had carried both victories and disappointments. He wanted to believe she was mistaken, confused. And yet, a part of him, the part that had learned to read markets and people alike, knew instinctively she was telling the truth. He glanced back at her. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said, barely above a whisper. "Amara, do you know who I am?" Her lips pressed together, then she nodded. "They kept saying your name, Mr. Collins, over and over." She paused, then added quietly, "I don't think they like you very much." The simplicity of her words stung deeper than any corporate betrayal. Children had no reason to invent such things. Richard finally turned the key, the low hum of the engine filling the silence. He guided the car out of the parking garage, the girl still curled in the back seat. As they emerged onto the city streets, neon signs flickered against the windshield, and Richard's mind raced. Tomorrow was the day, the meeting with Japanese investors that could seal Collins Tech's future for decades to come. Harold and Victoria had personally arranged every detail, and now he couldn't ignore the possibility that the very hands he trusted most were the ones reaching for his throat. They drove in silence until Richard finally asked, "Why tell me this? You don't know me." Amara shifted, hugging her thin arms around herself.
Because I know what it's like when people pretend you don't exist. They were talking about you like you were nothing. My grandma always told me, if you see someone being stepped on and you can help, you should, because one day it could be you." Her words landed heavier than any business deal ever had. A child living who knows where carried more wisdom and loyalty than the two people Richard had trusted for years. He pulled the car into a small diner on the corner, one of those late-night places with buzzing neon lights and chipped vinyl booths. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food wrapped around them like a blanket. He ordered her a hamburger and sat across from her as she devoured it hungrily. He pretended to sip his coffee, though it had gone cold in his hands, his thoughts already circling the storm that was coming. His phone buzzed on the table. A message lit up the screen from Harold. "Big day tomorrow, partner. The Japanese investors are going to love our proposal. You'll retire richer than you ever dreamed." Amara leaned over to read it, a smear of ketchup on her chin. "He's lying," she said matter-of-factly. "He was laughing about how you trust him too much." Richard's jaw tightened. Another message appeared almost instantly, this one from Victoria. "Jonathan, I've reviewed all the documents again. Everything is perfect. Trust me, as you always have." Her words, once comforting, now felt like poison. 10 years of loyalty reduced to a single dagger disguised as affection. Richard set the phone down slowly. He looked across the booth at Amara, who was licking her fingers clean, watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Richard felt something stirring inside him. It wasn't despair. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. He realized that the empire he had built wasn't truly being threatened by external competitors. The real danger sat inside his company, wearing smiles he had long mistaken for loyalty. And thanks to a little girl who had risked everything to speak up, he had one priceless gift: time. The next morning, Richard walked into Collins Tech as if nothing had changed. The lobby gleamed under the bright lights, the marble floor reflecting polished shoes and hurried footsteps. To every passing employee, he looked the same: calm, approachable, the steady presence that had led the company for years. But inside, every sense was heightened. Every smile from Harold, every reassuring nod from Victoria carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. "Richard!" Harold's booming voice carried across the corridor. He strode toward him, suit perfectly pressed, his hand extended like a lifelong friend. "Big day tomorrow. I hope you slept well, because you'll need all your energy." Richard shook his hand, forcing his lips into an easy smile. "I did, Harold. Couldn't be more ready." Harold's eyes gleamed, though there was something predatory in the way he held his gaze a beat too long. Minutes later, Victoria appeared at his office door with a folder pressed against her chest, her expression sweet and efficient as always. "Good morning, Mr. Collins. I stayed late last night, reviewing everything again. Everything is in order. Tomorrow, all you need to do is sign where I've marked. Leave the details to us." Her voice dripped with the same comforting tone she had used for over a decade, but now Richard heard it differently. He nodded, offering a soft, "Thank you, Victoria," while his mind catalogued every word. The attacks were subtle at first, disguised as kindness, wrapped in loyalty, but they came one after another. Emails filled with, "Don't worry, just trust us." Meeting reminders where Richard's presence seemed almost optional. Private whispers that silenced when he entered the room. Each was designed to box him into the role they had chosen for him, a figurehead too trusting to notice the walls closing in. And still, he played along. That evening, Richard sat across from Amara in his study, the city lights glittering through the tall windows. She was curled up in a chair too big for her, sipping hot chocolate from a mug that dwarfed her small hands. "They really think you don't see it," she said quietly, almost to herself. Richard leaned back, the leather chair creaking. "That's their mistake." Amara looked up, curious. "They believe loyalty makes me blind," he continued, "but it's loyalty that has taught me patience. I've built this company by watching markets, people, patterns, and now—" He let the sentence fade, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. She studied him for a moment, then nodded with the seriousness only children carry. "My grandma used to say, people show you who they really are when they think you're not looking, and you have been looking." Richard's phone buzzed again. A message from Harold. "Don't stress over tomorrow. We've prepared everything. It'll be effortless for you." Then another from Victoria. "I've highlighted all the pages for your signature. You won't need to review a single clause. Trust me." The arrogance was almost breathtaking. They weren't just underestimating him. They were mocking the very trust he had given them. Richard slid the phone across the desk to Amara. She frowned at the glowing screen, then gave a soft laugh that carried both disbelief and contempt. "They're smiling while sharpening their knives." He didn't answer, only reached for the folder of contracts on his desk, flipping it open slowly. The words blurred before his eyes, not because he didn't understand them, but because he now understood too much. Every clause, every number, every highlighted mark might be the key to erasing him from his own empire. Yet he closed the folder with deliberate calm. Let them believe tomorrow is their victory.
Outside, the city thrummed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, neon lights flickering, people chasing their own battles. But inside the Collins home, a different kind of storm was brewing. That same night, when the city had quieted and Amara had finally drifted to sleep on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin, Richard stood by the window, phone in hand. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, tired, weathered, but with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: resolve. He scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name he hadn't dialed in over a year: Samuel Ortiz. Samuel had once been Collins Tech's lead investigator, a former detective with eyes that missed nothing. He had been let go after Harold insisted his constant digging was unnecessary. At the time, Richard had trusted Harold's judgment. Now, the truth of that decision pressed against his chest like a weight. The line clicked. "Collins?" Samuel's voice was deep, laced with surprise. "Didn't think I'd ever hear from you again." Richard exhaled slowly. "I need your help, Sam, and I need it tonight." Within 2 hours, Samuel was in Richard's kitchen, his rugged presence filling the space. His hands were scarred from years of fieldwork, his gaze sharp, even under the soft glow of the overhead light. Across from him, Amara sat on a stool, munching on a cookie, her legs swinging as if this were all perfectly normal. "So," Samuel said, glancing from Richard to the little girl, "I hear you've got yourself a whistleblower." Amara smirked around her cookie. "I just listened. They weren't very quiet." Richard couldn't help but smile. "She's sharper than most adults I know." Samuel opened his worn leather briefcase, pulling out a tablet. "While you've been trusting the wrong people, I've been keeping tabs. Old habits die hard. And Harold? He's been sloppy." On the screen appeared spreadsheets, transfers, names of companies Richard had never heard of. They've been funneling money, millions, into shell corporations. 2 years' worth of siphoning funds while smiling in your face. The merger tomorrow isn't just business growth, it's a cover, a way to wash everything clean once your signature is on the paper. Richard felt the anger rise in him, cold and steady. "They've stolen from me, from this company." "They've stolen from everyone who ever believed in you," Samuel corrected. "Employees, partners, even clients. This is bigger than betrayal. It's crime." Before Richard could answer, Amara leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the curiosity and boldness of a child who'd seen too much. "If they've been doing this for so long, don't you know anything about them? Don't you have secrets too?" Her question struck him still. He did. 15 years of partnership with Harold, 10 years of shared confidences with Victoria. He knew where the skeletons were buried. Meetings Harold hoped no one noticed. Emails Victoria thought were deleted. Moments they assumed Richard, ever trusting, wasn't paying attention. A slow smile touched his lips.
You're right, Amara. They know everything about me, but I know just as much about them. Samuel leaned back, nodding. Then that's your leverage. Let them think they've cornered you. Tomorrow, you don't walk in as their victim. You walk in as the one holding the strings. The plan began to take shape. Evidence gathered, recordings prepared. For the first time since the betrayal had cracked open, Richard didn't feel like a man waiting to be destroyed. He felt like a man quietly sharpening his tools.
And Amara, wiping her crumbs with the back of her hand, whispered, almost like a promise, "They think you're blind, but you're not." The next afternoon, at precisely 2 o'clock, the grand conference room on the top floor of Collins Tech gleamed like a stage set for history. Floor-to-ceiling windows washed the space in golden light, while the long mahogany table was neatly arranged with contracts, glasses of water, and pens carefully aligned. Harold was already there, radiating confidence in his tailored suit. Victoria stood beside him with a leather portfolio pressed to her chest, her smile warm, her voice honeyed. Richard, Harold greeted, striding forward with open arms as if welcoming a brother. What a day! The Japanese investors are moments away. Everything is perfect. All you have to do is sign, and our future is secured. Richard returned the handshake, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad you feel so confident, Harold. Victoria." She stepped closer, sliding the contracts toward him. Yellow tabs marked page after page. "Here, Mr. Collins, I've highlighted every signature line, just as I always do. You don't need to waste your time on the details. You've trusted me for years, haven't you?" The words, meant to comfort, carried the sharp edge of condescension. Richard lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table. For a long moment, he simply ran his hand over the papers, his silence stretching into something that made both Harold and Victoria shift uneasily. Then, without looking up, he said calmly, "Before I sign anything, I want to show you something." The door opened. Samuel Ortiz entered, carrying a heavy briefcase, followed by 2 federal investigators in dark suits. Their presence changed the air in the room instantly. What had been smooth and confident now cracked with tension. Harold laughed, though it sounded forced. "Samuel, I thought you were no longer with the company." "I'm not," Samuel replied evenly, setting the briefcase on the table. Richard connected his laptop to the projector. The screen behind him flickered to life, filling the wall with spreadsheets, transaction logs, and photographs. "Tell me, Harold, Victoria," he said softly, "do these numbers look familiar?" Rows of transfers appeared, amounts siphoned to shell corporations with no employees, no offices, only names on paper. $7.3 million. 2 years of theft laid bare in black and white. Victoria's smile faltered. Harold shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Richard clicked again. Images appeared. Harold entering and leaving offshore banks, Victoria signing documents under false company names. Then audio recordings, their voices crystal clear. Victoria's words rang through the speakers. "Richard's too sentimental. Tomorrow he won't even know what he's signing. By the time he realizes, it'll be too late." Harold's voice followed, smug and cruel. 15 years pretending to be his friend. It'll be worth it just to see his face when he loses everything. The silence in the room was deafening. Then the door opened again. Small footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Amara walked in, her hair neatly brushed, accompanied by a social worker who stood quietly at the back. Despite her size, her presence seemed to fill the space. "Hello, Mr. Grant," she said clearly, her voice steady, though she barely reached the height of the table. "Remember me? I was hiding under your desk when you called Mr. Yamamoto and said you were stealing Collins Tech." Harold's face drained of color. "This is absurd. Bringing in a child? You can't be serious." But before he could continue, Samuel pressed play on another recording. Victoria's voice again, unmistakable. "He's nothing but an old fool. By the time we're done, Collins Tech will be ours." Victoria's hand trembled on her portfolio. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, no words coming out. One of the investigators stepped forward, sliding a folder across the table. "Mr. Grant, Miss Lane, we have enough evidence to charge you with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. You are under arrest." Handcuffs clicked. The echo rang like a gavel in the silent room. Harold slammed his fist against the table, sending papers flying. Richard finally rose to his feet, his voice calm but sharp as steel. "No, Harold, you set yourself up. I only let you walk into the trap you built." Victoria broke down in tears as she was led away. Harold struggled, cursing under his breath, but the investigators guided him firmly out of the room. When the doors closed, silence lingered. Richard looked at Amara, who was still standing bravely by the table. She tilted her head, eyes filled with both fear and triumph. "Are they really going to jail?" she asked softly. Richard bent slightly, his voice gentle but resolute. "Yes, Amara, for a very long time." The investors who had sat in stunned silence through the ordeal finally spoke. One of them leaned forward, bowing slightly. "Mr. Collins, integrity like yours is rare. If you'll allow us, we'd still like to discuss a partnership with you." Richard nodded, but his gaze never left Amara. In her small frame, he saw not only the child who had saved him, but the truth he had almost forgotten. Sometimes strength comes from the most unexpected places. The conference room slowly emptied, leaving only Richard, Samuel, and Amara standing by the long table littered with abandoned contracts and scattered papers. Outside, the flashing lights of police cars painted streaks of red and blue across the glass walls as Harold and Victoria were escorted away. For years, Richard had carried their smiles as a symbol of loyalty. Now he saw those same faces twisted with fear and anger as they disappeared into the night. He adjusted his tie, more out of habit than necessity, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For 15 years he had trusted blindly. Today, he had learned that trust could be both a weakness and a weapon, depending on how it was used. Amara tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Collins, are you sad?" He looked down at her, her small hand still clutching the fabric of his suit jacket. She had seen too much for a child her age, yet her question was as pure as it was disarming. "No, Amara," he said softly. "For the first time in years, I'm not sad. I'm free." Over the next weeks, the aftermath unfolded swiftly. Harold was sentenced to 12 years in prison, Victoria, 10. Their assets were seized to compensate for the damage they had caused. Investigators uncovered that their scheme had stretched far beyond Collins Tech. Multiple business owners came forward with similar stories of fraud. Justice was not only served for Richard, but for many others as well. Meanwhile, Collins Tech thrived. Investors who had once hesitated now called daily, eager to partner with a company that had survived betrayal with its integrity intact. Within months, profits soared, and the weight of deceit that had quietly drained the company for years was lifted. But Richard's greatest change wasn't financial. It was personal. Amara, once a frightened girl hiding in the back seat of his car, became a daily presence in his home. He enrolled her in school, bought her books, and made sure she had a safe place to sleep every night. Slowly, her wary eyes softened, her laughter returning in moments she once thought were impossible. One evening, as Richard looked over some documents in his study, Amara padded in, holding a school report card. Her smile was hesitant, but her eyes sparkled. "I got an A in math," she announced proudly. Richard set down his pen and took the paper from her hands. "Of course you did," he said, his voice catching. "I never doubted you." Samuel, who had dropped by to check on progress, watched the exchange with a quiet smile. "Hard to believe," he said, "that this little one saved a $200 million empire." Richard glanced at Amara, then back at Samuel. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "She saved much more than that. She saved me." It was true.
Money could be rebuilt, companies could recover, but the kind of trust Amara had given him, without reason, without expectation, was priceless. Months later, Richard launched a new initiative, the Amara Foundation, a scholarship and housing program for vulnerable children. In its first year, over 100 children received education and shelter. And every time he stood on a stage to announce the foundation's progress, Amara stood beside him, her chin lifted with pride. The empire Harold and Victoria had tried to steal was stronger than ever. But for Richard, the real victory wasn't numbers or partnerships. It was standing in his kitchen at night, watching Amara color at the table, humming softly to herself, safe and unafraid. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after that fateful boardroom showdown, Richard stood at the podium of a crowded hall. The banner above him read, "The Amara Foundation, First Anniversary." Rows of children filled the seats, some nervously clutching new backpacks, others whispering to one another with shy excitement. Beside him, Amara adjusted the microphone with both hands. Her hair was neatly tied back, her eyes bright, her dress a soft blue that swayed with every nervous step. She glanced at Richard, and he gave her a reassuring nod. She took a breath and spoke. "Do you know what the best day of my life was?" Her small voice carried across the hall, steady and clear. "It was the day I got into Mr. Collins's car. Because that day, I wasn't just helping him, I was finding a family." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Richard blinked against the sting in his eyes as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. In that moment, he realized the greatest twist of all. Harold and Victoria had tried to take everything from him, but their betrayal had given him something priceless. Not just the strength to fight for his company, but the gift of a daughter and a new purpose. Later that evening, as the celebration quieted and the last of the guests departed, Richard found Amara sitting on the steps outside the hall. She held up her math notebook proudly, an A+ marked in bright red. "Dad, look!" Richard crouched beside her, studying the paper under the glow of the streetlights. He smiled, pulling her into an embrace. "That's the only signature that really matters to me." Her laughter echoed through the night, light and unburdened. And as Richard looked out at the city skyline, he understood the message life had carved into his heart. True justice isn't only about punishing betrayal, it's about discovering who deserves your trust. True wealth isn't measured in contracts or balance sheets, but in loyalty, love, and the courage to do what's right. The pen Harold and Victoria had tried to erase him had instead written the beginning of a story far more powerful than profit. The story of a man, a child, and the family they built from the ashes of betrayal. At its heart, this story reminds us that betrayal, no matter how painful, can open the door to unexpected blessings. Richard lost the trust of people he once called family. Yet in that loss, he discovered something far more enduring: the strength of honesty, the resilience of patience, and the pure loyalty of a child who dared to speak the truth. Life often teaches us in the hardest ways that appearances can deceive, but character never lies. For many of us, especially as we grow older, we've seen how power, money, or position can distort relationships. Yet this story reminds us that true worth is not measured by titles or bank accounts, but by the courage to do right when it is inconvenient, and by the dignity we show when others underestimate us. As the old saying goes, character is what you do when no one is watching. And sometimes justice arrives not in grand gestures, but in the quiet bravery of those society tries to overlook. The lesson is simple but profound. Never allow betrayal to make you bitter. Instead, let it sharpen your vision of who truly deserves a place in your life. Value the ones who show up for you with sincerity, even if they are the most unlikely people. Because at the end of the day, wealth fades, but integrity, kindness, and family, chosen or found, are the treasures that endure. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a betrayal that turned into a hidden blessing? Share your experience in the comments. Give this video a like if the message resonates, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength within.
wishing you peace, clarity, and hope no matter the storms you may face.